if you touch him.
Do not come between the Nazgul and his prey.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film and Comics Explained, and today we'll be exploring the Nazgûl as featured in the expanded Lord of the Rings universe. As with all things Tolkien, the Nazgûl were known by many names, often called the Ringwraiths, Black Riders, or simply as the Nine. In the film version of The Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn states that the Nazgûl were once men, great kings of men. Then Sauron the Deceiver gave to them 9 rings of power. Blinded by their greed, they took them without question, one by one falling into darkness, and now they are all slaves to his will. It's interesting to note that this description is only mostly correct, as not all the Nazgûl were kings. In the famous poem that describes the Rings of Power, it states that there were 9 for mortal men doomed to die, not kings, and Tolkien himself describes them in the Silmarillion as kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. Very little is known about these men before they became corrupted by Sauron, but it is known that 3 of them were originally great lords of the Númenórean race, including the Lord of the Nazgûl himself, the Witch-King, who was most likely a sorcerer. If you'd like to learn more about the Númenóreans and their relationship with Sauron, I'll leave a link to where you can check it out below. Now, the other 6 Ringwraiths were originally natives of Middle-earth, mostly from the east and south, and could have included kings of regions such as Rhûn, Harad, and Khand, thus binding these kingdoms to Sauron and Mordor should he have need of them in times of war. The most notable of these kings was Cumhal, the Black Easterling, second in command of the Nazgûl, and the only one whose actual name is known. I talk about the Rings of Power in another video, which I'll also leave a link to below, but suffice to say that shortly after the 9 rings were created in the Second Age of Middle-earth, Sauron gave them to his 9 champions. Roughly 800 years later, the Ringwraiths first appeared in Middle-earth. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien states that before becoming wraiths, they obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to be their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in the world invisible to mortal men, but too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength, and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and of the domination of the one which was Sauron's. It's interesting to note the similarities between the effects of the 9 rings and the effects of the One Ring on Bilbo, Frodo, and Gollum. Bilbo obtained glory and wealth. Frodo and Bilbo also both walked unseen by all eyes when they turned invisible. Frodo could also see worlds invisible to mortal men while wearing the ring, like when he saw the Ringwraiths in their true form on Weathertop, and Gollum appeared to have unending life, dying at the ripe old age of 589, which is pretty good for a hobbit. Presumably, if all these 3 hobbits had continued to use the One Ring, they would have eventually ended up much like the Nazgûl. Once these mortal men had fully succumbed to the power of the 9 rings, the rings were returned to Sauron for safekeeping, while the men became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. In the film version of The Hobbit, it's implied that the Nazgûl had at one stage been killed and entombed before being resurrected by the Necromancer. This was done by the filmmakers to justify the use of the name Necromancer from the books, but in reality, the Ringwraiths never died until the end of the Third Age with the death of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring. Because they never truly died, they were not spirits or ghosts, but beings of flesh and sinew made invisible and undying through exposure to the dark power of the rings. The power of the Nazgûl was tied to the power of Sauron. When he was destroyed in the last alliance of men and elves at the end of the Second Age, the Nazgûl disappeared. When Sauron resurfaced, so did the Nazgûl. As Sauron grew in power throughout the Lord of the Rings, the Nazgûl also became more powerful. And this can be seen when Aragorn managed to hold 5 of them at bay at Weathertop in the Fellowship of the Ring. And yet when the Witch-King confronted Gandalf in the Return of the King, they were much more evenly matched. The Nazgûl also sensed things more differently to others. Their sense of hearing and smell was enhanced, and they relied upon this during the day when their sight was diminished. They could also smell the blood of living things at all times and feel their presence. They couldn't see light, but instead the shapes cast by shadows, and this is the reason why their sight was weakest at noon and strongest at night when all was in shadow. The Nazgûl used an array of weapons including steel swords and knives, and the Witch-King wielded a mace during the battle for Minas Tirith. Another particularly nasty weapon used by the Witch-King was the Morgul blade, which would disintegrate on touch with a living creature, leaving a shard of the blade in its victim, which would slowly work its way to the heart and turn them into a wraith. Frodo was stabbed with this blade on Weathertop and was only saved through the intervention of elvish medicine.
There's no
Baggins is round here. They're up in Hobbiton. That way.
The most effective weapon at the disposal of the Nazgûl was probably fear. Their deadly voices rent the air. More unbearable they became, not less, at each new cry. At length, even the stout-hearted would fling themselves to the ground as the hidden menace passed over them, or they would stand, letting their weapons fall from nerveless hands, while into their minds a blackness came, and they thought no more of war, but only of hiding, and of crawling, and of death. Excessive exposure to this fear could cause a person to contract the Black Breath, of which symptoms included drowsiness, unconsciousness, bad dreams, hallucinations, hypothermia, deep despair, and, if left untreated, eventual death. As mentioned previously, only one of the Nazgûl was ever named, Khamûl the Black Easterling, who was second in command to the Witch-King. Khamûl is most easily recognised as the Ringwraith that asked Farmer Maggot of the whereabouts of the Shire, and the one that sniffed after Frodo and his friends as they hid behind a tree, eventually pursuing them to Buckleberry Ferry. It's interesting to note how easily the hobbits fooled Khamûl when he was but inches away from them, but this was due to the fact that Khamûl, of all the Ringwraiths, was worstly affected by daylight, which both diminished and confused his senses. However, he was also the one who could most readily sense the presence of the One Ring, which is why he was chosen to lead the hunt for it. Therefore, had it been nighttime, the hobbits would not have gotten away so easily. Khamûl was also known as the Lieutenant of Sauron. 10 years after Sauron was chased away from Dol Guldur and Mirkwood by Gandalf and the White Council, as seen in The Hobbit, Khamûl moved in, accompanied by 2 other Ringwraiths. During the War of the Ring, Khamûl and his armies made 3 separate attacks on Lorien and the kingdom of King Thranduil in Mirkwood from Dol Guldur, but each time his attack was repulsed by Galadriel and the power of the Ring of Adamant, Nenya, which he had held. When the Witch King died, Khamûl abandoned Dol Guldur and returned to Mordor to take over as the new leader of the Ringwraiths. With Sauron's lieutenant in Dol Guldur gone, Galadriel herself came out of Lorien and utterly destroyed the Fortress of Evil, which had stood there for over 2,000 years.
Go back to the abyss! Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master.
Do you not know death when you see it, old man?
The other Nazgûl of note is of course the Witch-King of Angmar, Sauron's second in command and the leader of the Nine. Though his name is not known, it is known that he was a Númenórean and a very powerful one at that. I mean, he'd have to be to become the leader of the Nine. His title, the Witch-King, gives us some hints as to his origins. He only attained the title after founding the northern kingdom of Angmar, which implies that he was not a king before this time. And the witch part of the title indicates the use of magic, which strongly suggests that he had abilities before becoming a Ringwraith, and was most likely a black Númenórean sorcerer who opposed the Valar, instead worshipping Morgoth and the darkness. The Witch King also enjoyed powers and abilities that the other Nazgûl did not. He could set things on fire like his own sword. In the books, he was also able to break Frodo's sword with a wave of his hand, and physically weaken the gates of Minas Tirith so that they might be breached by the great battering ram Grond. In the films, he shatters the staff of Gandalf. Any weapon that connected with the Witch King was immediately destroyed, and its wielder poisoned so severely that it was said to be worse than a direct blow from his mace. This happened to both Éowyn and Merry, and it was only through Aragorn's use of the Athelas plant that the two were saved. Now, the Witch King has a long and detailed history, which I'll save for another video, but I thought it might be worth leaving you with the little known fact that it was most likely the Witch King that had killed the last kings of Gondor, thus beginning the rule of the Stewards before Aragorn returned to claim the throne. Well, that's all for today, folks. Big thanks to all of you guys who requested we take a look at the history and lore surrounding the Nazgûl. Don't forget to hit subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content. And if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.